Hey guys, I'm back from the beach. I've had my lungs full of fresh air and I feel a little refreshed. Played a couple of games on my phone in the car on the way home, which was kind of interesting, and it reminded me of a chess saying. And I don't know where it originated, but the saying goes that the winner of a chess game is the person who makes the second to last mistake. And so what I've got here is I've got 3 games. 2 games that I've played this afternoon, and then 1 game that was sent to me by one of my followers or one of my students. I'm not sure which one. And it's completely random. I haven't seen the game, and I thought we'd look at that one last. Okay, so the principle. The winner of the chess game is the one who makes the second to last mistake. And what that means is that chess games are decided by mistakes, errors, blunders, inaccuracies. The only real difference is that the scale of the error gets more fine, I think, as you get better and as you climb up the rating ladder. Okay, so we're going to look at 2 games that played with 1300, 1400, and then we're going to look at one that's lower down the scale. Okay, so let's just dive in, and really what we're doing is we're looking for mistakes and how the mistakes decide the flow of the game, right? And it's also important to notice that if you're playing a strong player, right, then you make a reasonably bad mistake, then you could probably expect that mistake to cost you the game in one way or another. But at the level I am, right, at the intermediate or lower levels and beginner levels, then you can still count on your opponent making another mistake later on. So here's 2 examples. Okay, so this is a game that I played this afternoon. My opponent's rated just under 1400, and we play the French. Okay, so they've got the white pieces, I've got the black pieces. E4, E6, D4, D5. And now E5, so this is the French advanced variation, and I play C5. Okay, so I'm competing for the central pawn, and there are several ways for white to respond to this. One of the most obvious ones, and the one that you'll probably see most likely at lower levels, is just to push c3. So now if I capture the centre pawn with my c-pawn, white will recapture with his c-pawn, and we've got an open c-file and relative equity on the board. So now I come out with my knight to c6, and now I've got 2 attackers on here, but there are also 2 defenders. I've got pawn and queen. So very often in the French, this pawn is a target. So you're trying to line up your forces against that pawn. Now, white now plays the aggressive f4, something I don't often like to see, but it means they're creating kind of a lot of space behind their pawns as well here. So now I play queen to b6, again another thematic move in the French, and now I've got 1, 2, 3 attackers and 2 defenders on this pawn. So I'm threatening to overwhelm the pawn, basically win the pawn. So now knight to f3 adds a 3rd defender. Okay, and now f6, again very thematic move in the French advanced variation, at least. When there's a pawn on here, you push f6 and you're trying to get the pawn to capture, and you probably recapture with a knight. Then you can release your bishop and then probably castle kingside, put your rook on the semi-open f-file and start to cause trouble up that side of the board. You also need to think that white may also have potential problems castling as well. They've moved their f-pawn. It's not the end of the world at this point. If you're going to castle kingside, as long as you can get to castle, put your rook on there. That rook can then become more aggressive. Okay, so bishop to d3. And now I decide that it's time to push c4. You don't often want to push c4 in the French, and I don't know whether this is actually a mistake on my part, but I figure that now that they've brought out the light squared bishop, let's pressure the light squared bishop. So it's really taking away most of this diagonal from that bishop, and the bishop now drops back to c2. And now I push f5. So I'm deciding to compete for space myself. So I've already pushed f6, and now I push f5, really trying to take options away from this bishop and think about maybe some kind of pawn, big pawn push up the king side. And now white plays b3, now attacking my c4 pawn. There's not an awful lot I can do about that right now. So I decide to capture with the c4 pawn, at least because my light square bishop is kind of weak, as it very often is in the French, and then so I quite like the idea of opening up this diagonal anyway. And we have a takes b3, now freeing up this a rook, and now I play my bishop to d7. So maybe I'm getting ready to castle my king here and try and bring both of my rooks into a kingside attack. Okay, so white castles kingside, and I push h6. It's just taking this square away from the knight. I don't want the knight coming in there and making a nuisance of himself. We have bishop e3, bishop e7, and now b4. Okay, and now I push the g5 pawn. Possibly this was premature, but and I did this consciously, knowing that white has 1, 2, 3 attackers against that square, and I've only got a pawn and a bishop defending it. But at the same time, that's where the king is, you know. So I figure I can give up a pawn. You know, sometimes you have to think, look, if I could just take these pawns off the board and throw them on the floor, would that make my position stronger? Now I'm 2 pawns worse off, but suddenly I can castle and I can throw everything at my opponent's king. Now that my opponent is castled, I'm still uncastled at this point in time. So we have takes, 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 takes. Okay, so now I'm down a pawn, but this was consciously done. Now I make a mistake, I think. Yeah, okay. Castles long. Can you see the mistake? It's pretty obvious. Knight f7. There's a knight fork on both rooks. Oh no, my rook. So I move my knight out the way. White has a choice of rooks, takes one, and now so I'm now down 3 points. I'm down a pawn, and I'm down the exchange. Okay, but more importantly, I've only got 1 rook now facing off against white's king. We have knight to d2, and now right, this is another mistake on my part. Okay, now that we're in the business of spotting mistakes, I saw a nice little move here at this point. Okay, and the move is knight takes d4, pawn takes d4, queen takes d4, boom, and it comes with a fork on king and rook, and the rook is undefended. What I failed to notice, because I took my eye off what my opponent was doing, is that knight to d2 is a discovered defence on the rook on a1. But I think, aren't I clever? Here we go. Get in there. In fact, if that knight hadn't moved, takes, 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 and the queen is actually defending that square as well. So with the knight moving there, I don't know. I just got confused, right? So it wasn't. This is an unrated game as well. I wasn't playing my most serious. So takes, takes, takes. Now I've just given up a knight for 2 pawns. Okay, so now I'm down 4 points in material. With check, king simply moves out the way, and I grab a pawn. Okay, so I've got 3 pawns for my knight, and it's not too bad. I mean, so white's only got 3 pawns left on the board, but does have a whole extra rook. So, you know, it's not too bad. But anyway, this comes with a checkmate threat of its own, which is quite good. But knight to f3 now does 2 things. It hits the queen, and it's also covering this h2 pawn. So a good move there by white. And I simply move my queen into f4. And we have a proposed exchange of queens. No, thank you very much. Because the other thing I realise here is also that with this pawn's actually also hanging. I think it might even have been better for white to capture that pawn straight away on this move. But they go for that, and it gives me the opportunity to drop my queen all the way back to b8 and defend the pawn. So now we have queen to d4. That's adding a second attacker to this. I guess I could here have pushed b6. But instead I decide to move my knight out. Queen captures pawn. Now, what I do not want at this point in time is to capture white's queen and then have the possibility of the rook coming here. King has to move because it's a skewer on the king. potentially forcing an exchange of rooks, and I don't want that. But however, if I allow white's queen to take my queen, I capture there, and then rook a8 is not playable because the rook would be undefended. Okay, so now I'm moving my knight back round to here, and I'm figuring maybe we might have ideas of the knight and the light squared bishop ganging up on this pawn here. So we have queen takes, and now I move my bishop to attack the rook. Queen takes, king takes queen, rook moves away. Knight attacks rook, rook moves and counterattacks the knight, and now knight goes to g3, with check, which is a safe square because this pawn is pinned by the rook. But it's only a half-hearted attack. King moves, I move my knight now back to e4, and now white decides to trade off my knight, okay, which is kind of okay for me. I'm quite happy to have the only bishop left on the board. The board's wide open, it's good, happy hunting ground for bishops. Knight now has to move, comes with a fork on bishop and pawn, but this is okay, because I can drop my bishop back to d7 and protect the pawn. And now for some reason, I mean this is clearly a mistake. I don't know whether it was conscious or just a slip, but white, being a whole rook up at this point, minus a pawn, decides to capture the pawn, and I say thank you very much for the knight, that will do me. Now the rook comes in here, kind of half looking at the pawn. I push my pawn up to b6, rook comes down, king comes up, and now we've got the rooks pairing up on the a file, and this isn't too bad. I figure that as long as I keep my king off of the same rank as my rook, I'm probably okay here. Now rook to g2, with maybe now ideas of playing the bishop there and capture the pawn, or at least force the pawn to move. Check, king moves, check, king moves, rook to b6, and now I decide to take advantage of the imbalance that's in my favour, which is that I have these two very nice central passed pawns. Okay, white's most advanced pawn is here, but it's in traffic, and these two are all the way back in the starting blocks. Okay, so now I have both rooks on the 7th rank, that's not too bad. Now I move my bishop up, so again, you've got to have some kind of counter-attacking idea, you've got to have a plan. If I'm going to win the game, how am I going to win the game? All right, so you've got to have some idea, particularly when you're not playing an advanced player. So the idea here is simply rook f8, rook f1, checkmate. Okay, so now we have rook to e4, and I now maneuver my rook very, very quickly. Yeah, 2 seconds, I thought about that, hoping that my opponent would grab the pawn. My opponent doesn't grab the pawn, instead notices the checkmate threat and creates an escape square for the king. I push the pawn so it's protected by its neighbour, and now we have a check, and now I grab the pawn. So we trade off a couple of pawns, that's fine by me, and I move my king here. Rook moves across, pinning the bishop, so I move my king again, and now rook to here. Now there's another mistake. Okay, can you see how white in this position could win material? Okay, so the move I play is rook to f2. Now white plays rook a3 check, and I have 4 squares, okay, but unfortunately all of those squares move my king away from the defense of the bishop, which is currently under attack. So I'm forced to move my king away, and I lose now my bishop, so I'm still a full rook behind. I bring my rook back to d2 because I don't want white to double up and simply win by force by removing my pawn, and also we've got ideas of promoting this guy. King comes across, rook to d1 check, king comes to e2, rook back check, king moves back, and I grab a pawn. So slight slip up by white there, and now again he renews this idea of the barrage on d4, so I put my rook back because he can't capture. Rook takes, and if we swap off rooks, that should be better for black, seeing as I've got this very, very advanced pawn, but at the least it should be a draw. So now h4 is played, rook to h2, abandoning the defense of that pawn, and rook takes, king moves, and we have some toing and froing with the rook and the king. Now, if you are black, what do you see in this position? Okay, how on earth can black win in this position with being a full rook down? Okay, well, my idea is to get my king to f3. And the reason is I've got this pawn and it's guarding these two squares. Okay, it's not guarding e2. But if I can get my king to f3 and get my rook on the back rank, would actually be checkmate with the king in this position on e2. So rook comes there, I put my king to f3, rook to a4 is simply a blunder, because now rook h1 is actually checkmate. Okay, that's it. Pawn's guarding those, king's guarding that, so the king can't go to any of these. Simple back rank checkmate. Okay, so I mean, in this position with 16 minutes on the clock, I think this is a 15 plus 10 game. There's no excuse for that, really, to lose like that. I mean, for me, it's a fist pumping win, but yeah, I mean, it simply shouldn't happen. So, what's the point of the lesson? Is that, you know, this guy's rated nearly 1400. Okay, yes, he's playing an unrated game, so it's not, you know, it's not critical. But even so, with 60, it doesn't take 16 minutes to spot a checkmate threat. It's simply a mistake. So White made the final mistake. I made plenty of mistakes of my own, but it's the final mistake that costs the game in this instance. Okay, let's move on to game number 2. Right, here again, it's another 15 plus 10 unrated game. Again, my opponent's just rated under 1400, and again, I've got the black pieces. So here we have d4, and I play f5, which is the Dutch defense against d4, and now we have e4, and this is something that I haven't come across very, very much. I do remember looking into it quite a long time ago. It's called the Staunton Gambit. And what happens is now I play some very natural moves, but quickly end up in quite a lot of hot water. Okay, so f takes e4. It's a free pawn. It's undefended. Why not? You know, I thought, does my opponent know what he's doing? Okay, now knight to c3. And what's the most natural move here? Okay, so I've got this extra pawn. And what do we know about gambits? And when you get an extra pawn, your opponent gives you a free pawn. You know, does it come with strings attached? Well, it does. What you probably shouldn't do is try too hard to hang on to the extra pawn. But then I'm thinking, okay, is this a gambit that my opponent knows well? Or is my opponent just being silly and has just given away a pawn? So I now here play knight to f6. Another obvious move would be d5. But here, of course, I'm trying to hang on to the pawn. Okay. Now bishop now to g5, and that's no real problem. You know, bishop can take my knight. I'll then recapture. I might even recapture with the e-pawn and try and rebuild my pawn structure, or I can recapture with g. In fact, recapturing with g might be very problematic because of queen h5 could actually be checkmate. So that could be a problem. I think I'd have to recapture with the e-pawn so that I've got the option of g5. Anyway, but let's see how this Staunton Gambit works. Okay, so now I play d5. A very, very natural move. It's solidifying the center. The knight can't take because queen defends. The pawn's defending that pawn in case he wants to grab my bishop. And I feel like, you know, I'm a pawn up. I'm getting a fairly solid position here. So we take, I recapture with the e-pawn. I think this is very important because, if we recaptured with that, then queen here would have, have forced the king now to d7, and then queen takes d5. That's looking very nasty indeed. Okay, so I capture with the e-pawn, and queen here, and g6, and boom, queen takes d5. Okay, this is probably a very, very typical trap in the Staunton Gambit. So I'm no longer a pawn up. There is an option to trade queens here. I do have an advantage in kind of, I've got 3 pawns out at least, but I don't have any pieces out. So I play my knight out to c5, figuring that if white wants to trade queens, I can just trade queens. Now they bring their bishop out to c4. So now there is a checkmate threat. Queen c7, sorry, f7 would be checkmate. So I place my queen in the way. That prevents this because queen takes and he loses bishop. And now he develops his final knight. And I develop my bishop to f5, just shoring up this pawn chain again. This pawn now does have 2 defenders. And the knight comes into f4. And now I propose a trade of queens. But of course I undefend the f7 square. So I have to move my king. Now knight comes in with check, and this is starting to look, very scary indeed. So I'm basically king c8 is forced. Can play queen e8, but I can then block with the knight. So if the queen goes here, I can block with the knight. Knight takes knight, queen takes knight. It's still pretty even. So white now castles long, putting their rook on the semi-open d file. This is kind of nasty right now. So I move my queen back to e7, and we indeed have a trade of queens. Now the knight moves back up to e5. Okay, this is a mistake by a minor mistake, I would say, by white. Can you see the problem with putting the knight on that particular square? Okay, it allows me to develop my bishop to h6, pinning the knight against the king. White could undevelop his other knight, bring it back to e2 and protect that knight, but they choose to play g3, and I figure material is actually equal at this time, so let's give them doubled and isolated pawns, and that's forced to recapture with a pawn now. And now I play my rook across to d8. So, I mean, my issue at this point in time is material's equal, but I've got an awkward rook on a8. My king has not been able to castle. So I'm definitely on the back foot in this game. The only compensation really is these doubled and isolated pawns. Doubled and isolated on the f-file, and a single isolated pawn on the h-file. So the knight now comes round. I push c6. I'm trying to remove squares from this light squared bishop here. My light squared bishop is kind of happy on this side of the board. You've got ideas, maybe it could come here. Could look at the knight, look at d1. And white plays a similar move with b3, but it's a mistake. Why is it a mistake? Always need to be very careful when you've got a bishop out in the board, especially considering my last move. So my last move took away this square from the bishop. This square is unavailable for the bishop. This square is also unavailable. So's that, so's that, and so's that. There's only one square safe for the bishop. Okay, so now I play b5, and the bishop is forced to f7, but now rook f8, and the bishop is going to fall. So white, coming from a decent position, has actually essentially trapped his own bishop. So now we have d5. So, if I were to capture, bishop can capture, knight captures, rook captures, and he's lost no material that way. So I have to take the bishop now. Pawn takes c6, knight takes c6. Now the rook comes down, harassing the knight, but king c7, and that now releases my final rook. Okay, so I'm a piece up. This, I think, was an error, because it simply undefends the pawn on f6. I should have probably played my other rook to d8. Then if he takes, I can always take back with the knight. So that was a slip up by me. He grabs a free pawn. Okay, but I'm still up. I've got an extra bishop. He's got one extra pawn, but he's also got bad pawns. And the game here finishes fairly simply. I simplify by trading rooks. Rook d8 check. Improve my knight. Maneuver my knight round. So here I'm looking at rook and pawn. The pawn's defended by the knight. And this is an X-ray defense. It's a tactic you should know. So I'm saying to the rook, like either you trade off or you run away, but I'm defending the pawn through you anyway. So we trade off rooks, and now I grab a pawn, he grabs a pawn. I'm allowing him to exchange his knight for my bishop if he wants. Check with a fork, grab a pawn, trade off, and the game finishes fairly straightforward. I mean, these 3 pawns here could be relatively strong, but my counter threat of these pawns is probably too much. My knight comes around here defending this pawn, attacking this one. Obviously pawn pushes, but this is too late now. Okay, and I get a queen. So again, I was behind in that game. I was distinctly behind in that game. I made mistakes in that game. So did my opponent, but my opponent made the more critical mistake towards the end, allowing his bishop to get trapped, essentially trapping his own bishop by taking away a key square with this pawn to b3 move, and it's the mistakes that lost the game. Okay, let's move on to game number 3. Now this is a game that I haven't even looked at yet. I don't even know which side is which, but let's look at this together and look at whether it's mistakes or brilliance that decides the outcome of the game. So white plays e4, e5, d4, the centre game. Takes, queen takes. Okay, that's quite an early queen move. This is looking a bit more kind of like a Scandinavian now, so I'm expecting the knight to come straight out and kick the queen. That's what happens. Queen d5. Whoa. Feels like white's got his aggressive trousers on today. And yeah, knight f6 again kicks the queen. Queen moves back. So these queen moves have really just invited black to develop 2 minor pieces onto very natural squares completely for free. And look at the squares that these knights are now protecting. Okay, very, very good squares. Right in the middle of the board. Half of the middle of the board. Is it half the middle? Something like. Yeah. Half of the 4th and 5th ranks are now covered by these knights. And what's white got? White's got a queen out in space. Okay, now we have d5. It's defended twice, it's attacked twice. Pawn takes, knight takes. Okay, fair enough. Now, knight to c3. Knight takes, pawn takes. Now, here I would have recaptured with the queen just to avoid messing up the pawn structure. Okay, but white recaptures with the pawn. We have bishop out, attacking the queen. Queen comes to b5, here pinning the knight. Alternatives could have been queen to here or queen to here in terms of pinning the bishop. Maybe queen here, and then the bishop, light square bishop, could have come out to c4. That's a possibility. And now black plays their queen out. Okay. Now there is an issue here, is that I see that this pawn is undefended. But there's no major threat that I can see straight away against white, but you know, white's uncastled and is currently playing the game with 1 piece, which is not a clever idea. Okay, so white plays c4, attacking the queen, but now if queen takes queen and pawn takes queen, yeah, he's undoubled his pawns, but he's still well behind in development. Black's also got a nice idea of maybe castling long, putting the rook straight onto this open file. That could be really, really cool. So black here decides to just step away from that and give check. We have bishop blocks check. There is a hanging pawn on c2. But definitely I'm in favour of black in this position. That's a nice little move. Right, I like this. So this is, bishop comes out to b4 with check, so it's developing the piece. The bishop's protected by the knight and giving check, and this bishop now cannot defend both. Also, c3 doesn't work because simply bishop takes. Great move. I didn't even see that. The king is forced to move. Now rook d8. Now an alternative here, maybe a better move, would have been to castle long. It puts the rook on d8 anyway, but it also gets the king safe and it frees up this rook. So I think that would have been an improvement at this point. Anyway, rook d8 check. So now the king doesn't have these two squares. King's going to have to move again. And I mean, I guess they could block with the bishop, but then rook takes bishop. Bishop d3 is probably the better move at this point. Hitting the queen. Queen might come to there. Let's see what happens. Bishop d3, decent move by white. Okay, nice. This is interesting. This is very interesting. So, whenever you break a check with by interposing a piece, you're effectively pinning the piece. So that obviously you can only interpose a piece in an attack that's from a long-range piece. So it has to be bishop, queen, or rook. Okay, you can't interpose a piece in a pawn attack because pawn attacks are just immediate next square, and also you can't interpose a piece with a knight attack because knights jump; they don't go travel through space as such. But this is a very, very nice move by black. Queen can't take bishop because queen recaptures, and this bishop is still pinned, so can't take back. This is all very nice indeed. So what do we have? Queen to g5. Okay. I mean, I guess it's looking at the g7 pawn, but okay, now black just calmly castles. Nice move. See, I don't know what the ratings of these players are. I can't even see the moves. This is just a PGN that's been shared with me. Okay, and now king moves. Okay, so now we've broken the pin. This is important. But now I would expect bishop takes with check, if pawn takes, queen takes, and white is in a world of hurt. Okay, good. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. Perfect. All right. So now what's the king going to do? He's literally, the queen's right up against his nose. He's only got two legal moves. He comes out to f3. Wow. Okay. And who would want to be white in this situation? Oh, lovely move. Lovely move. Knight d4 check. Okay. Again, the bishop's pinned. Queen's pinning the bishop. Bishop can't capture. Right. This is just looking horrible for white. King moves back, okay, and now bishop with another check. I do not want to be that king. King moves back again. Now the knight moves away. It's now attacking the queen, and it's all going Pete Tong for white. Yeah, queen's defending that bishop, pawn's defending that bishop. But white is going to run out of space at this point very, very soon. Okay, knight to f4 is now even an option. Again, because this bishop is still pinned. Knight to f4, defended by that bishop. Okay, but we have h5. h5 now hitting the queen. Obviously, queen can capture, but can it? Yeah, I guess. Okay, so we have queen f3. Now what you really want to be able to do here is play knight g5 with a fork on the king and the queen. That would force the bishop to capture. Yeah, you just lose a piece there. So g5. Nice aggressive play. Even better, I mean, a pawn fork. Look at that, a pawn fork on here would be absolutely deadly. And look at white. Major piece, knight. Still sitting there in the box, fast asleep, haven't even played anything in the game. Here I suspect actually queen takes h5 might have been a good move. Completely removes the threat of that, but we have g4 instead. Pawn takes g4, king takes g4, and now f5 with check again. So the king can't go anywhere here. He's going to have to either go forward. No, can't go there either because of the bishop. Has now to go onto the h file. Wow. This is an arse kicking of the first degree. Okay, what are we going to see now? King move, get ready for the rook to come in. I don't know. Oh! Ouch! G4. Boom! Queen takes, pawn takes, king takes. Oh, good night. Elvis has left the building. Jeez. This is a first-rate attacking game. Really is. Now, rook to f3. So now we're a queen up. Black is a queen up, and he's going, I'm going to simplify. I don't care. I'll go down the exchange. I don't mind. I will swap this because you've now only got one move, man. Bishop attacks. Check. Is that even checkmate? No. The only possible move is bishop interposes, and now bishop takes, and I think that is a glorious checkmate. Wow, wow, wow. Well done. Well done to black in that game. And we've seen a bunch of errors, okay? Clearly we've seen errors. The centre game, error number 1. Moving your stupid queen out into the middle of the bloody board at the beginning of the bastard game. You do not do this. I mean, yes, look, if you know the Scandinavian and you know exactly what you're doing, then that's one thing, okay? But there are very few sound ways that you can take her queeniness out into the middle of the board right at the start of the game before you've established all your sentries. You know, you want these guys to be out in the board controlling a bunch of squares to prevent stuff like this and then this, right? And then this. You know? This is a horrible start. This is not how you play chess successfully, right? Again here, doubling the pawns. You know, these pawns are going to be really hard to defend. Why? Because they can't defend each other anymore, right? None of these pawns can protect each other in any way because they're not on adjacent files, right? That's the only way that pawns can work together. Okay, and now look, free development again. Queen moves out. Queen moves out with a threat. Wow, you know, and now checks. Because another problem, because we haven't done this, because we haven't developed this bishop and this knight, this king can't castle. So it's been caught, you know, in the middle of the board. Desperation, beautiful attack, more attacks, castles. It's like, oh, I might just castle now, right? I'm going to let up kicking your king's arse just for a moment. I'm just going to put my king safe. You know, it's lovely. I love this. This is just a whole heap of fun. Takes, and it's just now an exercise in masochism. Is it masochism? Sadism. See, this I thought was dubious. So I'm not sure why the queen didn't just capture here. I think the queen could have captured, but I don't know. Queen takes. We've got g6, maybe king g7, rook there. You don't want to be white in this situation, whatever happens. And this is just, this is great. I mean, the only way the king could have avoided that would be to go here. But it's just horrible. I mean, yeah. So, you know, could we say that white made some big blunders in the rest of the game? Not particularly, but this was a blunder. I mean, I was expecting white to be playing the Danish gambit and play c3 now. Okay, and pawn takes, and you've got either knight takes or you've got bishop out here. But no, this I think was just, you know, you're inviting your opponent to develop for free. So yeah, develop, it's fine, no problem. Yeah, and develop again, it's fine. You know, we'll fight later on, right? For now, just get all your pieces out into the board, kick my queen around. You know, I'll pick her up later. It's fine. But you know, white just never got a chance to get into this game from this point, and it all goes just horribly wrong. Even here, you just don't want to be white. I think, you know, black could have done all right by castling long as well, even slightly earlier on, with lots of threats, you know. Yeah, but so one blatant mistake, and it happened to be really early on in the game. And quite honestly, from this point on, White was just clinging on by his fingernails. So there you go. There you go. 3 interesting games, 2 of my own where I was quite honestly behind at one point. But don't give up, because your opponent very, very often is going to make another mistake. We are not master level chess players, we're casual players. And it is, guys. It's mistakes that cost the game. The mistakes could be towards the end, as we saw with, what was it? This guy, a full rook up, and gets suckered with a back rank checkmate. Okay, or it can be right at the start of the game by bringing your queen out too early and allowing her to get kicked around the board like this. Even at this point, you should think about retreating your queen. Retreat your queen, but stop giving your opponents free development, because this is just horrible. But beautiful game. I mean, thank you for sharing that, whoever shared that with me, because that was absolutely lovely. A lovely, beautiful game. All right, well, there you go. So, what are we saying? We should don't give up when you're behind. Okay, just because you're a rook down. Okay, just because you're a rook down against a player rated 1375 is not a reason to give up. You can play on, because players, everybody that I've played in my experience makes mistakes, right? Or can make mistakes. Yes, you can have a 1000 player who does a 98 accuracy game, right? That does happen, okay? But you can also play a 2000 player who somehow plays a 60 accuracy game and lets you win. So yeah, don't give up just because you're behind on material. You should always be open to the possibility of your opponent making mistakes, but at the same time, we should be endeavouring to cut out our own mistakes. And how do we do that? Okay, the risk of sounding like a broken record, we do it by slowing down and by saying, okay, if I play this move, what is my opponent likely to do? Is that better or worse for me? Okay, that's how you play chess. That's how you improve at chess. Okay, as you climb up the ratings and your opponents get tougher, then you need to be more subtle and you need to think a little bit deeper about that, but it's still the same old things. It's the usual checklist. Why did my opponent make that move? What just happened? What changed on the board? Like we saw in that other game, I had a great idea of a fork with my queen on the king and the rook, but when that knight moved, it's like the rook's defended. The tactic didn't work. It probably never did work. It was a half-baked idea. And am I capable of noticing, is it because I'm just too thick that I didn't notice that? No. I'm capable of noticing, spotting that knight move made that. You simply need to talk it through. Okay, what just happened? Okay, fold your arms. Bite your fingers. I don't care. Right? Talk to yourself. What just happened? Okay, the knight has moved from B1 to D2. Okay, what does that mean? It means that, okay, the queen is now defending the rook. You say, what has changed on the board? Just talk to yourself in your own language. Talk it out loud if you need to. What just changed? Okay, the queen's defending the rook. Okay, what does that mean? Oh, it means this knight sacrifice doesn't work. Duh. No, we're not talking about, you don't have to be Beth Bloody Harmon to figure that out. I know you can figure that out. I know I jolly well can figure that out as well. So don't be lazy, right? Give yourself enough time and enough space to calculate to the best of your ability. And if you're not training to the best of your ability, you're like somebody who goes down into the gym, picks up a really light weight and goes, right, now I'm going for a shower. Right? You're not going to, unless you're really testing yourself, you're not going to get the results and the gains that you want. And exactly the same thing in chess. So play worthy players. Play players who are a bit better than you whenever possible. All right? Give yourself enough time in your game, so play proper time controls. 15 plus 10 is a very, very decent time control. 30 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever it takes you to say, okay, I now can solemnly swear to myself that that is the best move that I think I can find on the board. If you're not doing that, then you're not playing to your best. You're just playing casual Patzer chess. And then there's nothing wrong with playing casual Patzer chess at all. Sometimes there's a time for it. That's what I use Blitz for. If I just want to dick about on the chessboard, I'll play some Blitz games. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with casual chess. But if you want to improve, if you want your rating to climb, if you want to take those, next steps along the road to chess mastery, then you need to be getting better. And the way that you get better is by stretching yourself. Okay? Simple as that. And you've seen, I've made mistakes of my own in these games, okay? But fortunately, so did my opponents, okay? That's what happens. We're human, it happens, okay? So that's all I've got to say about that today. Thank you for watching. Please like, please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. I really appreciate you guys. I'll see you soon.